This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
2021 has been a year of significant anniversaries for the People's Republic of China. October 25th marks 50 years since the United Nations General Assembly restored all its rights and recognized it as the only lawful representative of China at the UN. In addition to driving global economic development, China has been a major contributor to the United Nations budget and peacekeeping forces over the last few decades. As China celebrates this milestone in its history, we reflect on the country's reinstatement to the United Nations, unpack some of the achievements the country has had as part of the UN, and take a look at what may lie ahead. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. As well as making outstanding contributions to the United Nations in the last 50 years, China has fostered enduring friendships with African nations. Before we begin our discussion, we'll look back at some of the relationships developed between China and Africa and the role African countries played in the momentous vote that restored China's status in the United Nations. My colleague Daniel Kijo brings us more.
So, Doctor, let's go back over 50 years ago and remember the events that led to China being allowed into the Security Council, and also Tanzania's place, among other African countries, in making that happen.
Julius Nyerere, then President of the United Republic of Tanzania, started to campaign for China's admission in 1965 after he made his first trip to China, where he committed to support the One China policy. And after that, several speeches made at the UN General Assembly. The Nyerere president campaigned for China's admission, and he criticized the UN for excluding China in its UN Security Council. Not only that, but also Tanzanian delegates at the UN, and especially Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, who was a permanent representative of Tanzania to the UN, and among leaders who campaigned for China's admission to the UN, played a significant lobbying role to solicit votes for China's admission to the UN.
Why was this a big deal, not just for China, but also for many other African countries like Tanzania that were supporting China to get admitted? Why was this such a big deal?
Yeah, the Chinese achievement was a big deal mostly to countries of the global south, countries which were exploited, countries which were victims of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. But for China, having permanent position to the UN Security Council meant countries of the south had permanent representations in international security and peace, and also to the international global challenges.
What was at play? What dynamics were at play during this time to sort of impede and stop China from entering the UN Security Council? And how did African countries like Tanzania maneuver this attempt to stop China?
Generally, the threat was on the US's agenda to create two Chinas. The US wanted the Chinese government to have a dual representation, that it should be represented by the two governments, the Taipei regime and the Beijing regime. And it wanted so because the US was not ready to allow the PRC have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So it campaigned for the Taiwan so that it could control the UN Security Council, because as we know, Taiwan was under the control of the US government. So campaigning for Taiwan's position, it means to maintain its control of the UN Security Council. But during this time, friends of China, African countries, members of the UN, were strongly united to fight for China's position. That's why they managed to vote for admission of the Chinese government in the UN Security Council.
Now, how has China's appointment now into the Security Council helped Sino-Africa relations since then? Like, how have they benefited, and including Tanzania as well?
Yeah, soon after China has been admitted to the UN, the Chinese President Mao Zedong acknowledged the support he received from African governments, and particularly Tanzania. And since then, African governments which forged diplomatic relations with the Chinese government received several economic, political, social, and technical support. So then you can say that the relations between, the ties between the Chinese and African governments blossomed.
So now, 50 years later, China has been in the UN Security Council for many, many years, but is it still significant? That act that happened over 50 years ago today, does it matter for China and also for African countries like Tanzania?
Of course, and I think even the Chinese government itself remembers this a lot, because the day when China was admitted, it was like the celebration in all of the countries of the South that they won against imperialist countries. So it is a good day, a great day to remember for all countries in the Global South.
And joining me now to look back at China's contribution to the United Nations in the last 50 years are from Beijing, Victor Gao, Chair Professor Soochow University, Dr. David Monyae, Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, joining us from South Africa, and in Nairobi, Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa today. Victor, China was one of the architects of the United Nations and was the first signatory of the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945. Yet the People's Republic of China was kept out of the United Nations for 22 years. What were the reasons for keeping China out of the UN?
Thank you very much for having me. This is a very important question. China, as you know, was one of the most important victor nations in the Second World War. China and, at that time, the former Soviet Union, the United States and the United Kingdom, and to a much lesser extent, France, we fought together against Nazi Germany in Europe and imperialist Japan in Asia. And the founding of the United Nations was actually on the ashes of the Second World War. China fought very heroically for the establishment of the United Nations, and as you mentioned, was one of the first signatory nations of the United Nations. However, after the end of the Second World War, there was a civil war inside China. The communist soldiers and the nationalist soldiers fought against each other because they have different ways for how China should be led and how China should grow in the future. Eventually, in 1949, communists led the People's Liberation Army, as we call it, won the civil war, and the nationalist troops fled from mainland China to Taiwan. And by then, the nationalists, that is the Republic of China, was a member of the United Nations General Assembly, was a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, and they represented China illegitimately. And it is all the way up to 1971 that the United Nations shifted side from the Republic of China, that is Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China. And China, that is the People's Republic of China, regained its legitimate seat at the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council. And to a very large extent, this was done because of the great contribution of many African countries, African members of the United Nations.
Dr. Monyae, this is marking the 50th anniversary, of the People's Republic of China's restoration to its lawful seat at the United Nations. Tell us, why is it so important that this moment is viewed in China's history?
I think it is important for a number of reasons. One is for the UN itself, and given the strategic position of China as a member of United Nations Security Council, with its increased role, particularly in Africa's peace and security, as well as development. And this is taking at a time when China just celebrated its centenary, and it is moving forward in dealing with issues of strengthening multilateral, where China and Africa have a shared vision in terms of elevating peaceful ways of resolving crises in the world that we live in.
Ambassador Mwenche, unpack this for us, that UN Resolution 2758 that opened the way for China. Who tabled that resolution, and how was it passed?
Algeria is one of the countries that tabled the resolution, and of course Algeria, the African countries shared that common history of colonialism and backwardness that had come along with the colonialism, but also shared aspirations of gaining a rightful place in the international community to be able to restore their dignity. And by that time, very few countries of Africa had also become members of the UN Security Council, because going back to 1945, there were very few African countries. And so as they were joining, they were of course looking for common allies, because they knew that the theater of security was going to be still in the hands of the few who had supported colonialism. And so the countries felt that in China, they had a common ally because of that common heritage that would support their struggle to gain independence, because even as of 1971, Africa was not totally independent, the case of South Africa.
Right. So I do want to come back to Chairman Mao's, speech there, where he said our fellow developing countries that carried the People's Republic of China into the United Nations. Why were African countries, do you think, why were they confident about China at that time?
Well, you know that after the Second World War, there was a great decolonization campaign involving the four corners of Africa. Many countries in Africa, through one way or another, many through national liberation struggles, won their independence from colonialist powers. And China established the diplomatic relations with the first African country, that is Egypt, very early in 1959, I remember. That's why, since the late 1950s, China-African relations, including many and increasingly more and more African countries, have been very, very solid. And this is one reason why there were so many African countries, which are members of the United Nations, which wanted to support, recognizing China as the sole legitimate representative of China, and supporting the People's Republic of China to regain its seat at the United Nations in place of the Republic of China. That's why the Republic of China, or Taiwan, lost its seat and is no longer a member of not only the United Nations, but not a member of the many international organizations in addition to the United Nations. And China-African cooperation has been moving forward in leaps and bounds over the past few decades, especially after 1971, when the African countries supported the People's Republic of China to regain its seat at the United Nations.
So, Dr. Mwenche, how do you see this shaping, China-Africa development projects and China-Africa friendships from that point?
I think the bond we established politically, as well as in the 70s, you had the very first major project, the Tazara, where African countries in Southern Africa were avoiding the apartheid government in terms of transport, and they had to establish their own transport to the sea to be able to have their goods and transportation in that part of the world. And China played a critical role in terms of assisting African countries financially and otherwise. It lost few people in the construction of the Tazara. And far beyond that, China played a critical role within the United Nations family in terms of development and all issues concerning the world peace and security, with an understanding that the bulk of global conflicts then and even now are in Africa.
All right. Ambassador Mwencha, I mean, African countries were critical and were pivotal to in China's diplomatic battle at the United Nations. Break it down for us, though, how this vote by African countries have shaped China and Africa's relationships from that point and moving into the future.
As David has indicated, way back in 1967, the government, the People's Republic of China, was already joining hands with Africa to support Africa to circumvent or face the challenge of sanctions that were imposed by South Africa, especially the frontline states that could not be able to access the ports, which were very vital to the economic development. China then decided to support the construction of the rail, the Sahara Rail, which starts from Dar es Salaam to Lusaka, somewhere Kapiri in Zambia. Now that was a major project and has several significant aspects. One of them being that at that time, China itself was a developing country and struggling with its own development challenges. But China, from even the perspective of the budget, spent about 25% of the annual budget to support the construction of that rail. That huge sacrifice underscores the sacrifice China was ready to put to its people so that it could support the liberation of Africa, and in particular, the elimination of apartheid. Now, from that on, friendship, and you've heard what happened, especially way back in 1955, China was already at Bandung Conference supporting Africa's liberation, but also Pan-Africanism. Now, of course, it is only after China started to modernize its economy that that development was again started in earnest. Coming back to the 90s, China was already starting to reach into Africa in terms of development support. But it was only by the year 2000 that the Forum for Economic Cooperation between China and Africa was established. And since then, the cooperation between China and Africa has been growing from strength to strength.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll look at what the future may hold for China and the United Nations. Don't go away.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Before the break, we looked at some of the history of China's involvement with the United Nations. Let's now look at what the future may hold for this important and symbiotic relationship, because Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in a recent speech that in the past 50 years, China has put into practice the purposes and principles of the UN Charter with concrete actions and safeguarded the legitimate rights and interests, particularly of developing countries. What have been China's contributions to the United Nations during this time?
China is not only a member of the United Nations, China is one of the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council. In that way, China has lots of responsibilities, not only for economic, environmental, and many other responsibilities as a global power, but also for political security matters of the whole world. And in this way, China fully recognizes the United Nations as the center of the current international order. China does not recognize any other country being on top of the rest of the world or try to put itself on top of the United Nations. And China supports the United Nations, especially in terms of peacekeeping forces. And also, China demonstrated in its own way how a developing country should behave as a member of the United Nations, not only in terms of eradicating abject poverty, for example, which China declared achieving that goal at the end of last year, 10 years ahead of the United Nations stipulated goals. China has also played a very important leading role in environmental issues, public health issues, and in more recent period, vaccines, for example, to fight against the scourge of the COVID-19 pandemic. And China plays a very important role in all the member organizations of the United Nations family, including UNESCO, WHO, WFO, for example, you name it. And China has been a major financing supporter of these international organizations headed by the United Nations. China also serves as a very good example for many other developing countries.
Let me rope in Dr. Monyai here and get a feel. China has been, a significant voice in the global space here. What's been its role and commitment to advancing global development over the last 50 years?
Advancement of its own peace and security within its own territory, I think, has helped to play a critical role within international bodies, particularly in the post-1978. As the Chinese economy grows, we see a China that is increasing its role within its own region and beyond in a number of areas to ensure that all the discussions of development are done in a manner that benefits the least developed countries. And you see all these activities within international bodies, in the IMF, in the World Bank, and a number of other agencies. We had the G77 plus China. We had quite a number of these roles, even at sub-regional level, where China contributed massively, particularly on the African continent, within the AU setting, the building of the AU headquarters, and far beyond that, in assisting the continent as it confronts new challenges. Currently under the COVID, we've seen China also increasing its role, dealing with the technical elements of how to combat COVID-19, as well as assisting with other areas in the arena of education, where more and more Chinese universities are opening their doors to African students. And as we go forward, I think we're going to see more or new areas in which Africans and Chinese will work together in dealing with new challenges that the world faces.
So the last 50 years, of course, a lot has changed in the global space, and particularly, in terms of multilateralism. What kind of UN do you think the world needs today?
China believes we are living in a multilateral world, and the United Nations should be the center of this multilateral world, and China refuses to recognize any power, big or small, trying to put itself at the center of the world or on top of the United Nations. And I think all the member states of the United Nations should rally behind the leadership of the United Nations. We are truly living in an equal world, whereas every member state of the United Nations, big or small, developed or developing or emerging economy, should be treated equal. We all should put a premium to peace and development and growth in the world should be shared more equally between the developed world versus the developing world. And I think we all need to provide security and safety in terms of food security for mankind as a whole. We need to unite together to mitigate the effect of climate change, because eventually the world should have one united front in terms of dealing with the impact of the climate change, rather than different countries try to hide behind their own separate national barriers. So I believe the world will be a better world and mankind will enjoy greater happiness if all of us respect the leadership of the United Nations and we all follow the leadership of the United Nations.
Ambassador Mwenche, do you think the UN has responded appropriately to the changing geopolitics over the last 50 years and to the changing environment in the global space?
The UN has continued to play an advocacy role, but it has been weakened, particularly by those superpowers, particularly members of the Security Council, who have seen it as a tool to manipulate the global multilateralism. But it is time that the UN, because multilateralism was the spirit under which the UN was established to bring about a community of nations, shared prosperity, shared peace. I would say here the UN needs to retrace its mission and assert its own original mission so that you can bring the global economy into harmony. Another threat that, in addition to what David has mentioned, is look at climate change. Africa only contributes about 4%, but has got the highest impact. If you look at decisions that are being made, if the multilateralism is weakened,
right,
Africa will continue to suffer, because whereas all this has been done under the umbrella of the UN, the implementation mechanism is lacking. And that's one of the weaknesses of the UN.
So what reforms, though, do you see as necessary at the United Nations today to adapt successfully to a changing 21st century global environment?
We're entering in the new territory when it comes to issues of space, for instance, where it looks and sounds like your wild west, where there are no rules and regulation in terms of how to manage issues of the digital and digital data. We're also getting certain rules where how should nations behave at the seas. And therefore, I think Africa and China could cooperate and work with other countries all over the world to channel multilateralism as the only way of coming together of family of the United Nations, coming up and resolve some of these new challenges that we're talking about. Health is becoming another major challenge. Chances are quite high that we're going to have more diseases that we are not used to, and therefore I think cooperation in the arena of health is quite critical. And therefore, I think China, with the advancement that it is making, working within multilateral, particularly the World Health Organization, Africans will definitely benefit in terms of contributing meaningfully in the knowledge about their health,
right,
as well as the infrastructure part of it.
And that's all for this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Victor Gao, Chair, Professor Suzhou University, joining us from Beijing. Dr. David Monyai, Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and Ambassador Erastus Mwenche, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, stay safe and goodbye.